Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Picture a trench, somewhere on a world whose name you will never know, in a war that started before your grandfather was born and will keep going long after your grandchildren have dust in their bones. The sky above is the color of an old bruise, that deep, pressing purple gray that happens when two suns set at slightly different times, and neither of them quite knows which one gets to decide what color evening is supposed to be. The air smells of promethium smoke, cold, wet clay, and something else. Something biological that you have learned not to think about too carefully. Something that lingers at the back of your throat and reminds you, quietly but persistently, that you are somewhere that was not safe before you arrived, and will not be safe after you leave. Inside that trench sits a man. His name is Adven Call. Now he is 23 years old, though he looks older. The guard ages you quickly. It is something to do with the combination of interrupted sleep, sustained low-level fear, physical labor carried out in difficult conditions, and an institutional diet that provides everything the human body technically needs and nothing the human spirit actually wants. He has been a trooper in the Astra Militarum, what most people simply call the Imperial Guard, for 2 years now, pulled from an agri-world whose single notable feature was that it had just barely enough people to satisfy the planetary governor's tithe quota for the year. Before that, he worked fields. He tended irrigation channels that ran through red soil, and he watched the sky for the orbital freighters that would take the food he grew to people he would never meet on worlds he would never visit. He watched the same sky cycle through the same seasons, and he thought, occasionally, about what was beyond it. Not in a restless, ambitious way, just in the way that anyone might think, looking up at something vast, about the fact that vastness is real and they are small inside it. That was his life. That was enough. Then the Munitorum's scribes came. They looked at ledgers. They counted heads. They matched numbers against quota tables that had been calculated by adepts sitting in offices on worlds neither they nor Adven would ever see. And the tables said that this agri-world owed the Imperium a certain number of able-bodied persons between certain ages with certain physical parameters. And Adven Call fit the parameters. He became a number in a very long column, and the column said it was time. 2 years later, he is crouched in a trench at a place the regimental stratagem calls Red Line 7, eating his evening rations. The ration tin in his hand is small, gunmetal grey, with a ring-pull lid and text printed along the side in low Gothic. It says, "This is flavor 9 of 16. He has eaten flavor 9 before. He does not particularly want to eat flavor 9 again, but the alternative is flavor 11. And something about flavor 11 tastes faintly of the color of fear, and he doesn't want that either. There is supposedly a flavor 14 that some of the veterans in the regiment speak about with something approaching reverence, not because it tastes good exactly, but because it tastes of something specific enough to name, which gives it a landmark quality in an otherwise featureless dietary landscape. He has never personally encountered flavor 14, and is no longer certain it actually exists. This is the life of an Imperial Guardsman. This quiet, unglamorous, dangerous, waiting, scratching, aching, praying life. And I want to dwell here for a while, because the story we are going to tell today begins exactly here, in the mundane. It begins with a man and a tin, and it ends somewhere so cosmically strange and so deeply unsettling that it reaches into some of the most carefully guarded secrets in the entire Imperium of man. The Astra Militarum, taken as a whole, is a force so vast that the Departamento Munitorum, the logistical bureaucracy that keeps it fed, armed, moved, and accounted for, cannot with any certainty tell you how many soldiers exist at any one time. The lists of new recruits and the rolls of the dead come in at such volume, from so many worlds, through such complicated chains of communication, that the numbers blur into something closer to philosophy than arithmetic. It is said that if every Imperial Guardsman were to form up into a single column and begin marching from holy terror. That column would stretch across the stars all the way to the fortress world of Armageddon, and by the time the last soldier stepped off-world, the first would have long since forgotten what terror looked like. Billions, some scholars say. Trillions, say others. And those people are probably closer to the truth. Each one of these soldiers, at some point, opens a ration tin. The standard Imperial Guard combat ration pack comes in a metallic pouch or a sealed tin and contains the nutritional minimum required to keep a human being functional under combat conditions. Not comfortable, not well fed. Functional. There is enough protein, enough carbohydrate, enough vitamin compound to prevent the worst kinds of malnutrition from setting in. The shelf life is rated at 160 standard years, which is a number that is technically impressive and practically grim. The nutrient gruel that fills most standard tins is described in official Munitorum documentation as semi-solidified grey porridge, adequate for field consumption, and the documentation further notes that 16 distinct flavor profiles have been developed to provide variety and prevent the morale degradation associated with dietary monotony. 16 flavors. Someone, somewhere, made deliberate choices about what 16 versions of grey semi-solid protein paste should taste like. They assigned those choices numbers. They printed the numbers on tins. They sent those tins to worlds across the galaxy, packed into the vast logistical arteries of the Munitorum supply network. And now billions of soldiers open them with varying degrees of resignation and eat what is inside, because there is nothing else. And the commissar is watching. And the alternative to eating is hunger. And hunger on the battlefield is a luxury nobody can afford. Around Adven, Call in his trench, the rest of the evening sounds settle in. From 3 sections down, the low murmur of 2 troopers who have been arguing about something for 4 straight days. He cannot hear the words. It's just the rhythm of the argument, the flare and settle pattern of 2 people who have been through enough together to be genuinely angry with each other and genuinely unable to stop talking. Closer, the faint scratch of a stylus on paper. Sergeant Thomas, writing in his notebook again. The notebook that everyone in the squad understands to be a diary, though no one would say so out loud, because it feels like an intrusion. And from somewhere in the middle distance, almost below hearing, the steady percussion of artillery at a range that is close enough to be constant, but distant enough to have lost all urgency. Like the heartbeat of something enormous and indifferent. This is the background of Adven Call's life. He has grown so accustomed to it that its absence on the very rare quiet nights disturbs him more than its presence. That he opens his tin. He is not thinking about anything significant at this moment. He has already decided between flavor 9 and flavor 11, and now he is reaching for the ring pull with the automatic efficiency of someone performing an action they have performed hundreds of times. The lid bends back. He looks inside, and something is very wrong. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, because before we look at what Adven Call finds, we need to understand the machinery that put it there. We need to understand what gene seed is. We need to understand the specific, extraordinary character of Primaris gene seed. We need to understand how a supply chain that should be as impenetrable as the walls of the Imperial Palace could have produced this moment. And we need to understand the full weight of what rests in the hands of a young man from an agri-world who just wanted his grey porridge. Section 2. The Anatomy of Service. Understanding the Guardsman's world. Before we climb into the lore of Gene Seed and Primaris Marines and the institutional machinery of the Inquisition, I want to stay close to the ground for a little while longer, because the texture of Adven Call's daily existence matters. Not just as atmosphere, as context that shapes every single decision he will make in the aftermath of his discovery. 2 years is long enough in the Astra Militarum to learn the things that are not written in any training manual. The manuals cover the basics: how to fire a laser gun, how to clean it, how to maintain it in conditions ranging from desert heat to swamp humidity to void cold. that they cover squad formations and how to fall back in good order. They cover the proper form for prayer and the proper posture for inspection and the proper way to address an officer. Carefully, briefly, with your eyes down unless specifically ordered to look up. What the manuals do not cover is the texture of the thing, the way fear settles into your joints on the night before an operation, the specific quality of silence that falls over a trench when something has moved, somewhere out there, and everyone has heard it, but no one is willing to be the one to say so first. The way you learn to read the mood of your commissar, not from anything they say, because commissars do not typically share their moods, but from the angle at which they hold their shoulders, and the frequency with which they inspect their bolt pistol. All of this knowledge is survival knowledge. It accumulates not through deliberate study, but through a process of environmental pressure, the way water eventually finds the shape of every container it inhabits. Adven Call has been shaped by 2 years of this pressure, and the shape it has pressed him into is, broadly speaking, the shape of someone who knows that the safest course of action is to be unremarkable, to do his job, to maintain his equipment, to participate in the minimum number of conversations with command that his position requires, to stay out of situations that generate paperwork, because paperwork generates attention, and attention in the Astra Militarum is not reliably a good thing. The institutional culture of the Guard is not one that rewards curiosity. This is not an accident. And the Astra Militarum exists to fight wars and die fighting them, on behalf of an Imperium whose governance depends on the vast majority of its population knowing only what they need to know to perform their function. The Guard is, in miniature, the Imperium's relationship with its citizens, writ in blood and promethium, a structure that requires bodies rather than minds, obedience rather than initiative, endurance rather than understanding. This is maintained at the unit level by the Commissariat, the Officio Prefectus, formally, though most soldiers just call them commissars, or, when out of earshot, names considerably less polite than that. Commissars of the Astra Militarum are not part of the regular chain of command. They exist outside it, alongside it, answering only upward to their own hierarchy. They have the authority and the standing orders to execute any member of the Guard, from the newest conscript to a regimental commander, for any failure of discipline, morale, or doctrinal purity they judge to warrant it. There is no appeal. There is no trial. There is the commissar, the bolt pistol, and then there is either the continued life of the unit or the continued conversation about whatever had warranted the pistol's appearance. This is not to say commissars are universally brutal. Many are not. The fictional commissar Chiaffus Kane, whose career exists in various states of documentation and disputed authenticity, is famous precisely because he was not. There are commissars who understand that morale is built from human relationships, and not just from the fear of execution, as who know that a unit held together by genuine respect and shared purpose fights better and for longer than one held together purely by threat. But even the most humane commissar is still a commissar, still invested with absolute authority, still operating within a system where the options for dealing with something unclear are accept it as innocent or escalate it into the machinery that handles things that are not innocent. And once something is escalated into that machinery, there is no taking it back. Adven Call knows all of this, not theoretically, in his bones. He has watched the system operate for 2 years, and he has internalized its logic the way people internalize any system they are embedded in long enough. He opens his tin. He sees what is inside. His hand closes around it. He does not call out. Yet that reflex, to hide rather than report, does not make him a traitor. It makes him a normal human being in an abnormal situation, operating on the survival instincts that 2 years in the Guard have sharpened to a fine edge. He is buying time, buying the few minutes he needs to decide what kind of person he wants to be next. The object against his palm is cold in a way that goes slightly beyond what the ambient temperature in the trench would account for. Slightly, persistently cooler than its surroundings, in the way of something that has been kept at a controlled temperature for a long time, and retains that quality even after leaving its controlled environment. He turns it over without opening his hand. He reads the mark on its side without understanding it. He reads the word Primaris without knowing what it means in this context. And now we need to talk about what it means. Section 3. What is gene seed? The foundation of everything. Gene seed is, in the plainest possible terms, the most sacred biological substance in the Imperium of man. It is more meticulously tracked than warheads. It is more religiously significant than most of the relics the ecclesiarchy displays in its cathedral vaults. It is more valuable, volume for volume, than any mineral resource the Adeptus Mechanicus extracts from 100 Forge World ore deposits. And it is the fundamental mechanism by which ordinary human boys are transformed into the beings the Imperial faithful call the Emperor's Angels, the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes. To understand gene seed properly, you need to understand that it is not a single substance. It is a collection of genetic blueprints, what the biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus call a complex of viral genetic machinery. When introduced into a suitable human body in the correct sequence, at the correct developmental stage, with the correct accompanying chemical treatments and hypnotherapy and physical conditioning, this viral machinery causes the body to begin producing and accepting a suite of extraordinary specialized organs. These organs are what separate an Astartes from an ordinary human. They are the physical infrastructure of transhuman existence. There are 19 of them in the standard gene seed package. The secondary heart is the first to be implanted, a smaller version of the human heart that can maintain blood flow if the primary fails and can boost circulatory capacity during extreme physical stress. A Space Marine does not keep both hearts beating simultaneously at all times. The secondary site's dormant until needed, activating during combat to allow an Astartes to sustain injuries that would kill an unaugmented human and keep moving. The osmodula is a small tubular organ that secretes hormones affecting the ossification of the skeleton. Under the osmodula's influence, a marine's bones do not just become denser, they absorb reinforcing mineral deposits and grow microcrystalline structures within the bone matrix that give them a resistance to impact dramatically beyond anything a normal human skeleton can achieve. The ribcage fuses. The skull thickens. The spinal column becomes a fortress for the nervous system within it. The biscopea stimulates the development of muscle tissue to a degree that simply does not occur in unmodified humans. A marine's muscles are not just larger, they are differently structured, fibered in ways that allow for a quality of contraction and sustained force output the unmodified human body cannot produce. The hemastomen alters the composition of the blood, introducing new chemical compounds that interact with the other gene seed organs to enhance their function and optimize the body's response to extraordinary demands. The Larraman's organ produces cells that coat wounds almost instantaneously, forming a near immediate biological seal that prevents blood loss and infection at a speed that makes conventional medical intervention almost irrelevant in all but the most catastrophic injuries. But the catalepsian node in the brain allows a marine to enter a semi-sleep state in which one hemisphere rests while the other remains aware. A space marine can go for extraordinary periods without conventional sleep by cycling through this state, maintaining the kind of alertness an ordinary human could not sustain. The preomnor is a pre-stomach, an additional organ that acts as a sophisticated preliminary digestive chamber, capable of neutralizing most biological toxins before they reach the main stomach. This is the organ that allows space marines to eat things that would kill ordinary humans: venomous creatures, chemically contaminated materials, substances no sensible nutritionist would describe as food. The omophagia is one of the strangest organs in the entire gene seed suite. It connects the digestive system to specific sections of the brain's memory and instinctive center, creating a pathway by which the DNA contained in consumed biological material, specifically animal tissue, can be read and translated into experience. A marine who eats the flesh of a creature can gain, in some fashion, that creature's instincts and environmental memories. This is why certain chapters have developed cultural practices around ritual consumption, and why those chapters have a reputation for looking at you in a very specific way when they eat. The multilung is an additional pulmonary organ that allows breathing in atmospheres with insufficient oxygen or elevated toxins. It works with the mucranoid, an organ that causes the body to secrete a waxy substance, sealing the skin against vacuum, extreme temperature, and certain chemical environments. Together, these give a space marine environmental resilience that removes the need for protective suits in many situations where a normal human would die without them. The melanochromic organ regulates the body's response to radiation and ultraviolet light, preventing cellular damage and producing pigmentation changes that are why space marines from certain lineages develop characteristic skin tones, why salamanders have deep black skin and red eyes, why Raven Guard tend toward pallor, why various other chapters show consistent physical traits tied to the interaction between their gene seed and their environments. Lyman's ear enhances spatial awareness, improves balance to a superhuman degree, and prevents the disorientation that would accompany rapid changes in orientation or extreme movement. While a space marine can fight effectively upside down, in free fall, or under intense rotational forces that would incapacitate a normal person. The oculobe improves vision, in terms of acuity, range, low light function, and the ability to process visual information rapidly. A marine does not just see better than a human, they process what they see faster. The neuroglottis extends the sense of taste into a sophisticated chemical analysis tool. A marine can identify substances by taste with a precision that approaches laboratory equipment, practical for identifying toxins and for tracking prey by the subtle chemical signatures they leave behind. The Susan membrane, when activated, can induce a state of complete metabolic suspension, a death-like stillness in which the body's processes slow to near halt, preserving life through injuries that would normally be fatal. Marines have survived in this state for extraordinary periods, and recovery, while prolonged and painful, is complete. The oolitic kidney filters the blood with extraordinary efficiency, removing toxins that have already entered the system with a speed and thoroughness that augments natural kidney function into something categorically different. The Betcher's gland, a paired set in the cheeks, produces a biological acid strong enough to dissolve metal. A space marine can spit a stream of corrosive fluid under controlled conditions, which has obvious utility in combat, in escaping restraints, and in the various grim situations that space marines regularly find themselves in. Then there are the progenoid glands, the 18th organ, and the one that matters most for our story today. These are the glands of biological reproduction, not in the conventional human sense, but in the specifically Astartes sense. Each marine has 2 of them, one in the neck, maturing approximately 5 years after implantation, one in the chest, requiring 10 years to fully develop. These glands collect and preserve the genetic information of all the other implanted organs, storing it in germ cells that encode the complete gene seed profile of the chapter. When a marine dies, or in some circumstances, when a living marine submits to the procedure, the progenoid glands are extracted by the chapter's apothecaries and returned to the chapter's gene seed repository, where they are cultured into new organ implants for the next generation of neophytes. So this is the only form of reproduction an Astartes truly knows. The gene seed carried in those glands does not carry the marine's personal DNA in any meaningful sense. It carries the primarchs. The genetic information passed down is the lineage itself, the mark of Sanguinius, or Guilliman, or the lion, or whoever the chapter's founder was. Each new marine is, in a very specific biological sense, an extension of a 10,000-year lineage reaching back to the demigods of the age of the Emperor. And finally, the black carapace, the 19th implant, the one that makes all the others make sense from the perspective of what a space marine actually is in the field. The black carapace is a layer of engineered biological tissue implanted in sheets directly beneath the skin of the marine's torso and limbs. It hardens on the outer surface and sends neural bundles inward, creating connection points throughout the body. When a marine dons a suit of power armor, this network of neural connections links directly to the armor's systems, making the suit not a piece of worn equipment, but a genuine extension of the body, felt, controlled, and experienced as the marine's own flesh. This is why Astartes' power armor performs categorically differently from the same equipment worn by an unaugmented human. All of this complexity, all of this extraordinary biological engineering, all of it derived from the genetic material the Emperor and his scientists developed in laboratories deep beneath the ancient Himalaysian mountains, what we call the Himalayas. During the late 30th millennium, before the Great Crusade transformed human history. And all of it begins with gene seed, with that carefully preserved, religiously guarded, institutionally controlled biological material that is the life of every chapter. The thing that an apothecary will fight through fire and enemy lines to recover from a fallen battle brother, because losing it is not just losing a person, it is losing a piece of the lineage, a piece of the future, a piece of the link back to the Primarch and, through him, to the Emperor himself. Gene seed does not belong in a ration tin. This is not an opinion. It is a foundational statement about how the Imperium organizes reality. Gene seed exists in a completely different category from ration tins, handled by completely different institutions, under completely different oversight systems, for completely different purposes. What the possibility of these two things, occupying the same space at the same time, is so far outside the operational parameters of normal imperial life that the first instinct of anyone with institutional knowledge upon discovering it would be to assume they were hallucinating. And yet, Section 4. The Primaris distinction, a new breed of sacred material. The word on the vial, that small, bone-colored, surprisingly heavy vial nestled in its molded insert in the center of what should have been grey porridge, is Primaris. Let us be precise about what that means, because it is the detail that elevates this scenario from merely extraordinary to potentially galaxy-shaking. Not all gene seed is equal. This has always been true in a general sense. Different chapters carry different lineages, different genetic quirks and advantages and flaws. And the stability of a chapter's gene seed has varied enormously across 10,000 years of cultivation. But in the current era of the Imperium, there is a newer and more specific inequality that matters enormously. The Primaris Marines are not simply bigger space marines. They represent a new iteration of the entire Astartes program, developed in secret over 10,000 years by the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, working on a commission given to him by the Primarch Robut Guilliman in the immediate aftermath of the Horus heresy, before Guilliman himself was mortally wounded and placed in stasis. The commission was simple in its statement and almost impossibly complex in its execution. Improve on the Space Marine template. Call spent 10,000 years doing exactly that. Yet when Guilliman was eventually resurrected in the late 41st millennium, through a combination of Mechanicus technology and the intervention of the Aeldari, he awoke to find that Call had not been idle in the intervening 10 millennia. The Archmagos had worked aboard his great ship, the Zar Quesitor, drawing on the genetic material preserved in the Sang Primus Portum, a device containing biological samples originally taken from the Primarchs at the height of the Emperor's genetic program, to produce an enhanced form of the Astartes gene seed, cleaner, more complete, closer to the original templates than anything cultivated in the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy. And then, using this enhanced foundation, Call had added 3 new organs that no standard space marine had ever possessed. The first new organ is the sinew coils, also called the steel within. A reinforcement of the tendons and ligaments of the Primaris marine's body with durametallic coil cables woven throughout the connective tissue. These cables contract with extraordinary force, amplifying the Marine's natural strength well beyond even the extraordinary standard of a firstborn Astartes. A Primaris Marine can crush a human skull with one bare hand, can bite through a metal cable. Even outside of power armor, a blow landed by a Primaris Marine carries force that would destroy armored vehicles if applied to the right structural points. The second new organ is the Magnificat, the amplifier, a small thumbnail-sized lobe of engineered tissue inserted into the brain's cortex, where it secretes a specialized cocktail of hormones that enhance the function of every other gene seed organ in the body. The Magnificat does not add new capabilities in themselves. It turns up the volume on the ones already present. A Primaris Marine's secondary heart works harder. Their muscles respond faster. Their bone density is greater. Their wound sealing capacity is more aggressive. Every system benefits, which is why Primaris Marines are on average a full standard third of a meter taller than their firstborn counterparts, and proportionally more powerful. The third new organ is the Belisarian furnace. This one is the most dramatic in its battlefield application. The furnace is a biological reserve of biochemical agents that activates in response to life-threatening injury, specifically the kind of catastrophic damage that would stop a standard Astartes from functioning. When triggered, it floods the Marine's system with a surge of biochemical reinforcement so powerful it can bring a Primaris Marine back from the edge of death, reigniting functions that had ceased and driving the body to continue operating, even through damage that should by all rights be terminal. Marines who have experienced the furnace's activation describe it as being struck by lightning from the inside. It is not pleasant, but it keeps them alive and fighting, which is the point. These three new organs, combined with the enhanced foundational gene seed from the Sancprimus portum, are what make a Primaris Marine physically different from a firstborn. But it is the genetic stability of the Primaris line that represents the truly significant difference from a law and institutional perspective. Standard Astartes gene seed. After 10,000 years of cultivation cycles, growing in apothecary vats, being implanted and growing and being harvested and grown again, has accumulated what geneticists measure as genetic deviance from the original baseline. For some chapters, this deviance is essentially cosmetic. For others, it has produced conditions ranging from challenging to catastrophic. The Blood Angels' red thirst and black rage, the Space Wolves' canis helix, and the terrifying devolution condition called the Wolfen curse. The progressive deterioration of gene seed in chapters like the Lamenters, who seem cursed by some combination of genetics and fate that makes every campaign they fight a tragedy of misfortune. Primaris gene seed has a measured deviance rate of 0.001% per generation. Let that number settle for a moment. Not 1%, or not 1/10 of 1%, 1,000th of 1%. The Primaris gene seed, grown from material closer to the original Primarch templates than anything in circulation since the first founding, is for practical purposes immune to the kind of genetic drift that has plagued the standard Astartes lineages for millennia. Chapters founded with Primaris gene seed should, in theory, never develop the catastrophic mutations that have threatened or destroyed so many firstborn counterparts. This purity has enormous implications. The Adeptus Mechanicus tracks gene seed with obsessive thoroughness. Every chapter is required, by ancient and binding covenant, to tithe 5% of its cultivated gene seed to the Mechanicus on Mars. But this tithe serves three purposes. It allows the Mechanicus to monitor each chapter's genetic health and catch deviance early. It creates a reserve that can be used to reconstitute a chapter after catastrophic loss. And it maintains Mechanicus institutional oversight over the most significant military resource in the Imperium. These tithes are handled with the ceremonial weight of religious rites. They move in sealed containers through dedicated transit routes, tracked at every step by multiple overlapping documentation systems, handled only by specifically authorized personnel. Primaris gene seed, under the current institutional framework, is subject to all of this oversight and more. Because the Primaris program is new, a mere few decades old in the cosmic timescale of the Imperium, the protocols around it are still being established. Call's own facilities maintain extensive reserves. The Mechanicus is developing new cultivation infrastructure. The newly founded chapters of the Ultima Founding are each beginning the long, slow process of building their own gene seed stocks from the material they were given at founding. Every single gram of this material is accounted for. Every single vial produced, transferred, cultivated, or tithed exists in a documentation trail that can, in theory, be traced backward to its origin point. This is why finding Primaris gene seed in a Guardsman's ration tin is not just strange. It is not just a logistics error or a Mechanicus accounting failure. Yet it is a crack in the foundational architecture of imperial governance, a rupture in the wall of control and oversight that the most powerful institutions in the galaxy have erected around the most important biological substance in human history. And Adven Call is holding it, in his hand, in a trench, looking at the word Primaris and not knowing what it means. Section 5. The Discovery. Cracking open the tin. Let us be very precise about this moment. Slow it down. Adven Call pulls the ring pull of his ration tin the way he always does. A habitual, slightly impatient motion, the kind of thing your body performs after hundreds of repetitions without requiring conscious direction. The lid bends back. The seal releases with a soft pop, barely audible beneath the ambient sound of the trench. What he brings the tin closer to his face, because the light is poor. The small hooded luminators that hang at intervals along the trench wall provide enough to see by, but not enough for fine detail. And he has learned after 2 years of rations to pay attention to fine detail. Occasionally, the protein component in a tin has turned, and eating turned protein in the field is an experience nobody wants twice. What he sees is not grey. There is no porridge. There is, in the center of a fitted, molded insert, of the kind that occasionally holds supplement capsules or puritabs, a single sealed vial, about 10 centimeters long, perhaps 2 centimeters in diameter. Smooth metal casing the color of old bone, not white, not yellow, but somewhere between the two in the way that ivory sometimes is when it is very old. The surfaces are seamless. The ends closed with ceramic caps showing no obvious joint. It is cold against his palm when he picks it up, in a way that goes slightly beyond what the ambient temperature would account for. Not dramatically cold, just slightly, persistently cooler than its surroundings, in the way of something maintained at a controlled temperature for a long time. On the side of the vial, engraved rather than printed, the lines clean and deep and precise, with the kind of tolerance that speaks of manufacturing to an extraordinary standard, is a mark. A cog symbol, radially symmetrical, with teeth that seem slightly too intricate to be decorative. Below it, a string of characters in High Gothic, some standard Mechanicus notation marks, a sequential identifier that means nothing to him without context. Below that, and in a slightly larger font given particular prominence by its position and the deliberateness of its engraving, is a single word. Primaris. He can read that word. He has enough High Gothic to manage it. He does not know what it means in this context. He turns the vial over. The underside has what appears to be a cultivation batch date, in a format he does not recognize. Mechanicus internal calendar, probably. There is no other text. No name, no unit designation, no intended recipient, no explanation. His first instinct is to hide it. Not report it, not cry out, not ask the sergeant. His hand closes around the vial, and it disappears into his palm, and he sits for a moment, with his closed fist resting against his knee, looking at his tin of flavor 9 that will now never be eaten, breathing slowly and deliberately. At this instinct tells us something very important about him. After 2 years in the Guard, the calculus of self-preservation has become second nature. Reporting something you were not supposed to have, even if you found it innocently,
Okay, I want to stop here for just a second and actually share what I think about this whole thing, because honestly, this is one of those scenarios that stuck with me for days after I first started thinking about it. What gets me is not a gene seed itself, it's the tin. It's the fact that the most sacred biological material in the Imperium, the literal inheritance of a Primarch, the thing Space Marine chapters will die to protect, ended up in the same category of object as grey porridge. That gap between how seriously the Imperium treats something and how casually it can still fail to protect it is what I find so fascinating about 40k lore. Like, the Mechanicus has 10,000 years of protocol, and the apothecaries are willing to charge through enemy fire to recover a single gland, and still a ration 10, flavor 9. To me, that's the setting in one image. The extraordinary and the mundane. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Even if you had no prior knowledge of it, generates paperwork. Paperwork generates attention. And the very specific quality of attention that unusual things bring down on ordinary people in the Imperial military is not, in Advencole's experience, reliably benign. He has seen what happens to people who stand out. He has internalized, through observation rather than instruction, the fundamental lesson of service. Do not be remarkable. Remarkable gets you noticed. Noticed can get you killed in ways that have nothing to do with enemy fire. So he hides it, and he sits in his trench, whilst the artillery marks the evening hours in the distance. And nobody notices that Trooper Call did not eat his flavor 9 tonight. The vial sits in his breast pocket, against his chest, a little cooler than his body, and growing infinitesimally warmer with every passing minute as his body gradually influences it. He can feel it there. It is not heavy, but its presence is somehow heavier than its weight. It occupies mental space the way unfamiliar objects do, with that slightly irritating quality of the thing you know is there, but cannot fully categorize. The thing that requires a decision you have not yet made. What he does in the next few hours will determine whether this moment remains a private anomaly in his service record, or becomes the first event in a chain that changes everything about his life. Section 6. The weight of the object. Thinking through the implications. The object in Advencole's pocket is, as we have established, a sealed vial of what appears to be Primaris gene seed. Let us think carefully about what this implies at every level, working outward from the immediate and personal to the vast and institutional. At the most immediate level, the vial should not be there, not in the sense of a simple logistics error that can be corrected and forgotten, but in the sense that the entire system of transportation, packaging, documentation, and distribution that the Imperium has constructed around gene seed specifically to prevent this kind of situation is sophisticated enough that the presence of a vial in the Munitorum supply chain represents not a simple mistake, but a meaningful failure, or a deliberate act. But the Departamento Munitorum does not handle Astartes resources. This is explicit in its charter and in the broader organizational logic of the Imperium. The Munitorum supplies the Guard. It does not interface with Space Marine chapters in any logistical capacity because Space Marine chapters are self-sufficient military organizations existing outside the Munitorum's administrative authority. The supply chain that produces, packages, and distributes ration tins is completely separate from the supply chain that handles gene seed, which is entirely internal to the chapter Mechanicus system. For a gene seed vial to end up in a Munitorum ration tin, these two entirely separate systems would have had to intersect at some point, which should be logistically impossible under normal operating conditions. The word normal is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and we should examine it carefully. The Indomitus Crusade changed the operational parameters of a great many things previously considered fixed. The deployment of tens of thousands of Primaris Space Marines across the galaxy in the immediate aftermath of the Great Rift's opening was an operation of extraordinary logistical complexity, conducted simultaneously with a galaxy-spanning military campaign against chaos incursion, Tyranid splinter fleets, orc rampages, and every other variety of existential threat taking advantage of the Imperium's moment of maximum vulnerability. In this environment, the careful, compartmentalized, painstakingly documented movement of gene seed through dedicated, secure channels was competing with the demands of 100 simultaneous crises for the attention of the people responsible for it. The administratum itself, the vast bureaucratic organism of which the Munitorum is a subordinate part, is documented as having whole departments whose function has been lost, whose records have become detached from their operational purpose, whose scribes continue diligently performing procedures that have ceased to make sense because stopping would itself require explanation, and explanation requires paperwork, and paperwork takes time, and there is never enough time. This is the nature of a 10,000-year-old bureaucracy serving 1,000,000 worlds. The organism grows faster than it can audit itself, or whole appendages exist in states of functional disconnection from the whole. Into this organism, the Primaris program introduced an entirely new category of material that required handling outside the standard frameworks, using new protocols that were still being developed, by institutions still negotiating their respective authorities over the new material. The friction generated by the intersection of Mechanicus authority over gene seed, Astartes authority over their own biological heritage, and Munitorum authority over anything moving through military supply channels, in the context of a galaxy-spanning military operation conducted under crisis conditions, produce the kind of administrative grey zones where things get lost. Things get routed incorrectly. Manifests get filled in wrong. And containers get labeled with the wrong destination codes or the wrong content identifiers or both, and then they move into the vast current of the Munitorum's distribution network, and the current takes them where the labels say to go, and nobody questions it because questioning requires authority, and most of the people handling any given container at any given point do not have authority over what it contains, only over whether it reaches its listed destination. This is the charitable explanation. It requires no conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary, continuous, grinding failure mode of an enormous institution operating under pressure. And it is, in absolute terms, the most likely single explanation for any individual vial. But it is not the only one, and the other explanations are considerably darker. Section 7. The bureaucratic horror. How gene seed officially moves. Let us spend time in the mechanics of how this material should be transported, because understanding the official system is the only way to appreciate how completely the official system has failed in this moment. In the sanctioned operational model, gene seed moves through the Imperium along two parallel tracks kept deliberately separate from each other and from every other logistical stream. The first is the internal chapter track. When a battle brother falls in combat, the chapter's apothecaries move immediately to recover the progenoid glands before they can degrade or fall into enemy hands. An apothecary carries on their arm a narthecium, a sophisticated field medical tool that contains, among other things, a device called a reductor, specifically engineered to extract progenoid glands with minimum collateral damage to the surrounding tissue. The apothecary will fight through enemy fire, will cross open ground under bombardment, will enter burning structures, will do whatever is physically necessary to reach a fallen marine and extract the glands before they are lost. There are accounts in the lore of apothecaries being killed in the act of gene seed recovery, dying to preserve the biological future of their chapter. This is not considered a sacrifice that requires justification. It is simply understood to be worth it. The math is brutal and clear. A single apothecary's death is recoverable. A generation of gene seed, lost to an enemy who consumes the battlefield, or to fire, or to simple elapsed time, is not. Once extracted, the glands are placed in sealed containers called genoseed flasks, armored, temperature-controlled, integrity-marked, and logged immediately before being transported back to the chapter's fortress monastery. There, in the deep frozen catacombs of the chapter's apothecarion, they join thousands of other sealed flasks, awaiting processing. The chief apothecary and the biotechnical staff begin the cultivation process, testing the glands for purity, stressing them with controlled radiation and chemical exposure to identify any deviants, and then, if they pass, beginning the long, careful culture process that will grow the recovered genetic material into the individual organ implants for the next generation of neophytes. This process takes years. The neck progenoid matures after 5 years and can begin being harvested and cultured. The chest progenoid requires 10. The cultivation of new organs from the harvested germ cells takes additional time. The entire cycle from the death of one marine to the implantation of his gene seed heritage into a new neophyte can span the better part of 2 decades. It is slow. It is deliberate. It is treated as a sacred duty at every step. The second track is the Mechanicus tithe, 5% of everything sent to Mars. This is not negotiable. It is one of the foundational obligations of the compact between the Adeptus Astartes and the Adeptus Mechanicus, and chapters that fail to fulfill it find themselves subject to institutional pressures they would generally prefer to avoid. The tithe shipments are prepared with extraordinary care, multiple redundant integrity seals, environmental controls, tracking sigils both mechanical and liturgical, documentation recording every hand the cargo has passed through, every transit point, every moment of its journey from the chapter's vaults to the Mechanicus's reception facilities. This is the system. It is thorough. It is designed with the assumption that gene seed is irreplaceable and that any compromise in its handling is a potential crisis. But the system has a fundamental dependency. It only works if the people operating it are doing so correctly, honestly, and without external interference. And in the current era of the Imperium, all 3 of those conditions are under pressure in ways that would have been difficult to predict even a century ago. The Indomitus Crusade moved gene seed across the galaxy at a pace the system had never been asked to sustain. As new chapters, being founded needed founding stocks. Existing chapters, receiving Primaris reinforcements, needed to integrate new genetic material with unprecedented speed. The cultivation and distribution of Primaris gene seed in particular, material that had never existed before and for which no standard protocols existed, was being managed on the fly by institutions simultaneously dealing with military campaigns of extraordinary intensity. The Adeptus Mechanicus, which considers itself the absolute sovereign authority over all matters of technology and biology, was asserting its oversight over the new Primaris gene seed while simultaneously navigating intense internal politics about whether the Primaris program itself was sanctioned or dangerously heretical. Till Call's modifications to the Astartes template had not been universally welcomed even within the Mechanicus. Conservative factions viewed the changes as a violation of the principle that the Emperor's designs should not be altered. These factions had influence over the very institutions responsible for tracking and monitoring the new gene seed. Their institutional foot-dragging, their insistence on additional verification protocols, their demands for access to documentation that Call was not always forthcoming with, created delays and friction at precisely the points in the system where smooth function mattered most. And threading through all of this, in the background, is the possibility that the system has not merely failed, but has been deliberately compromised. Because there are actors in the galaxy of the 41st Millennium who want Primaris gene seed, and who have the resources and the willingness to do terrible things to obtain it. Section 8. The Inquisition moves. What comes next? The discovery has happened. Adven Call has made his initial choice, and simultaneously, somewhere in the vast machine of imperial logistics, a discrepancy has been flagged. The Departamento Munitorum's Office of Records maintains documentation on everything moving through its supply chain. Every shipment has a manifest. Every manifest has a weight. Every weight is recorded against expected weight at multiple points in the chain. This is not done for sophisticated security reasons. It is done because the Munitorum is paranoid about supply theft which is a constant and pervasive problem when you manage the logistics of billions of soldiers across a hostile galaxy. Soldiers steal rations. Officers redirect supplies. Supply corps staff siphon goods to personal stockpiles or black markets. The Munitorum has been fighting this problem for 10,000 years and has developed extensive weight and number reconciliation systems to catch it. These systems also catch things going in the wrong direction. When a shipment is heavier than its manifest says it should be. When there is material in the supply chain the manifest does not account for, a discrepancy is generated. Not immediately. The system does not have that kind of real-time awareness, especially for shipments deep in the distribution network far from the cogitator banks of a major hub. But eventually, the numbers are reconciled, and when they are, the discrepancy is flagged to the appropriate oversight authority. A small weight discrepancy in a ration shipment would normally be assigned the lowest possible administrative priority. But the Mechanicus cog stamp on the vial, that precise, deeply engraved symbol marking Mechanicus originated material, may itself have triggered something. Mechanicus materials have their own tracking systems, sometimes integrated with Munitorum documentation at transit points where the two institutional networks intersect. A piece of Mechanicus tagged material moving through Munitorum channels generates a different category of discrepancy than a generic unexplained weight variation. It generates the kind of flag that reaches someone with authority to act on it and reaches them faster. As somewhere in the chain, at a depot, a transit hub, in the records of a supply vessel, a flag has been raised, and the flag has reached the attention of someone who knows what it means. In the Imperium, the choice of who handles a matter like this depends on a complex and not always predictable set of factors. Which institution filed the flag, which sector or subsector the incident falls under, who currently has jurisdiction in the relevant theatre of operations, and whether the nature of the flagged material is recognized immediately or only upon investigation. The Inquisition is the most likely eventual destination. The three Ordos Majoris divide the major categories of existential threat between them. The Ordo Malleus deals with demonic threats. The Ordo Xenos deals with alien infiltration. And the Ordo Hereticus, the witch hunters, deals with internal threats. Heresy, mutation, rogue psychers, and the corruption of imperial institutions from within. A missing vial of Primaris gene seed that has ended up in a random guardsman's rations would fall primarily under the Ordo Hereticus's mandate, because the most concerning possibility, gene seed being used to create unsanctioned, heretically altered post-human warriors outside the proper chapter system, falls squarely within their area of responsibility. But an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor might also have interest if they suspected the misrouting was the result of alien intelligence or manipulation. And a Malleus-aligned Inquisitor might get involved if there were any suggestion of warp involvement in how the vial got there. In practice, Inquisitors are not bound by their Ordo's theoretical jurisdiction. They go where they judge the threat to be. The arrival of an Inquisitor at a military position is not a subtle event. Even when the Inquisitor is attempting discretion, the aura of authority they carry, the literal power to execute anyone present, the ability to commandeer the entire regiment if they choose, the weight of 10,000 years of institutional terror that precedes them, makes their presence felt before they have said a word. Officers react. Commissars react. The rank and file react with the specific kind of frozen, wide-eyed stillness of people who have just become very aware that the things they were most worried about this morning were, in fact, the small things. Adven call, if he is still holding the vial when the Inquisitor arrives. M is in a position of extraordinary delicacy. If he surrenders it immediately and explains honestly that he found it in his rations and was uncertain what it was, he has a reasonable chance of being believed and released with minimal consequences, because this is actually a plausible account, and because an experienced Inquisitor can usually tell when they are being lied to. But if he has shown it to anyone, or attempted to sell it, or spent time researching what Primaris means, the calculus changes. All of those behaviors suggest intent, and intent is the variable that transforms a coincidental possession into a crime. Section 9. The possible explanations. 5 paths into the dark. Here is where we move from the factual into the speculative, and I want to be clear about that transition. While the mechanics we have been discussing are grounded in lore, the explanations I am about to offer are thought experiments, internally consistent possibilities built on that lore foundation, each one taking us somewhere different. There are 5 that I find most compelling. The first and most prosaic explanation is administrative failure at scale. The Indomitus Crusade moved more material through more supply chains, more quickly than the Imperium's logistics apparatus had been asked to manage since the Great Crusade 10,000 years ago. In that environment, with Primaris gene seed being distributed as a novel category of material through systems not designed for it, with institutional friction between the Mechanicus and the Munitorum generating grey zones in the documentation chains, and with the operational pressure of an active military campaign reducing bandwidth for oversight and auditing, in that environment, the wrongly packaged container, the misread manifest, the mislabeled crate is not just plausible, it is almost inevitable. The question is not whether this kind of error occurs. It is what fraction of total volume it represents, and whether that fraction is small enough not to matter. If we accept this explanation, the vial Adven Call found is one of an unknown number of similar vials scattered through the Munitorum's supply network through a chain of innocuous administrative failures. Most may have been found by people who did the sensible thing and reported them immediately. Some may have been found by people who did what Adven did and hid them, generating a subtler kind of discrepancy harder to trace. And a few may have found their way to people with the knowledge and the will to exploit them. This explanation is unnerving precisely because it requires no malice. It is the Imperium failing through its own weight and complexity, which is, honestly, the most authentic 41st Millennium horror, not the dramatic evil of chaos or Xenos invasion, but the slow, grinding self-destruction of an institution too vast to fully understand itself. The second explanation is internal Mechanicus sabotage, and this requires some understanding of the internal politics of the Adeptus Mechanicus, which are Byzantine in the fullest sense of that word. The cult Mechanicus is not monolithic. It is a collection of competing philosophical schools, forge world allegiances, generational tensions between tradition and innovation, and personal power struggles conducted in the language of theology and technical orthodoxy. Call's Primaris program sits at the center of several fault lines simultaneously. Conservative elements within the Mechanicus have, since the Primaris Marines were first deployed, been making the theological case that Call's modifications represent an unauthorized deviation from the Emperor's sacred designs. Their argument is not that the modifications are ineffective, the performance data is difficult to dispute, but that effectiveness is not the relevant metric. The Emperor's work is perfect. Improving it is a presumption so profound it borders on the heretical. Call's 10,000-year project, from their perspective, is not a triumph of imperial science, but a near miss of catastrophic arrogance. As a faction within the Mechanicus, believing this deeply enough, might be willing to introduce Primaris gene seed into unauthorized channels, not because they want it used for any particular purpose, but to create a visible, documentable security failure. The goal is the scandal. The investigation that follows the discovery will produce documentation of security failures around Primaris gene seed distribution, which can be used to argue before the relevant bodies of the Mechanicus hierarchy that the entire Primaris program requires additional oversight, additional restrictions, and possibly a fundamental review of its authorization status. This is politics by contamination, sophisticated, cold, and entirely in keeping with how institutional power struggles within the Imperium have been conducted for 10,000 years. The third explanation is chaos infiltration of the logistics chain, and this one is the most immediately alarming in its implications, because if chaos-aligned agents can insert material into the Munitorum's supply chain, they can also extract it. They can use the same channels for intelligence gathering, for distributing contaminated materials, for 100 purposes, all of them catastrophic. Chaos cults nest inside institutions for years, decades sometimes, before activating. They recruit individuals at every level of the organizational hierarchy, prioritizing people with access to documentation systems and physical materials. A single person with the right access, systematically misdirecting a category of cargo over months or years, he can move enormous quantities of material without generating the kind of immediate alert that a direct theft would cause. The goal in this scenario would be to get Primaris gene seed off-world and into the hands of someone who wants it for reasons the servants of the ruinous powers find interesting. The most obvious candidate is the traitor legions, Chaos Space Marines, whose own gene seed has been corrupted and degraded by 10,000 years of exposure to warp energies. Or the material might be destined for Fabius Bile, one of the setting's most enduring and most terrible figures, a Chaos Space Marine apothecary whose interest in human genetic potential has led him through experiments of extraordinary horror over the course of 10 millennia. And Bile has previously traded very significant genetic material for the kinds of resources he needs for his work. Primaris gene seed, representing the most complete and stable version of the Astartes template in existence, would be extraordinarily valuable to him. The fourth explanation is a radical inquisitor, or an agent working toward goals that are not officially sanctioned. The Inquisition contains multitudes: Puritans who hold rigidly to established doctrine, and radicals who have decided that the Imperium's survival sometimes requires operating outside sanctioned frameworks. A radical inquisitor who had concluded that the Primaris program needed more field testing, specifically, research into what Primaris gene seed does when introduced to subjects who are not the usual teenage Space Marine neophytes, might have arranged for material to move through unsupervised channels, not for malice, for research. Because some of the Inquisition's most radical members have made peace with the idea that terrible things done for good reasons are justified, even when the good reasons are speculative and the terrible things are certain. The fifth explanation is the one I find most quietly interesting. Adven Call was the intended recipient all along, not in the sense that someone who knows him specifically wanted him to have a vial of gene seed, but in the sense that the vial was placed in the supply chain with the intention of reaching a specific unit or a specific position or a specific individual. And through the ordinary chaos of military logistics, Adven Call is the person who happened to be at the intended endpoint. In this explanation, someone out there is waiting. Someone knows that a vial entered the supply chain at a specific point, routed to a specific destination, and has not yet received confirmation that it was recovered. Someone is, at this moment, trying to figure out where the vial is and who has it. And they are not waiting quietly. The question this raises, the one that makes this explanation so compelling, is what they want with it. A network that can insert material into the Munitorum supply chain and route it to specific endpoints is a network with extraordinary capability and extraordinary ambition. What they do with Primaris gene seed, if they get it, or could reshape the galaxy in ways that the institutions currently investigating its disappearance cannot yet fully imagine. Section 10. The Apothecaries, Stewards of the Sacred Chain. Before we address Adven Call's fate, I want to spend time with the Apothecaries, because they represent the most human face of everything we have been discussing. They are the people who stand between the gene seed and the void. They are the reason the chain has held for 10,000 years. And understanding what they do and what it means to them is essential to understanding why a vial in a ration tin is not just a logistics problem, but a wound. An apothecary of the Adeptus Astartes is not simply a medic. The role encompasses battlefield medicine, triage, treatment, emergency surgery conducted under fire. But the higher function, the function that defines the apothecary's relationship to their chapter, is the stewardship of the gene seed lineage. Every apothecary knows, with a clarity that other Marines may not quite have in the same form, that their job is not just to keep their brothers alive. It is to keep the chapter alive across generations. When an apothecary reaches a fallen battle brother and deploys the reductor, they are performing an act that has been described in the lore in ways ranging from clinical to profoundly sacred, depending on the chapter in question. For some chapters, the extraction is a procedure, important, yes, essential, but procedural. For others, it is a moment of ritual significance, the final gift that a fallen warrior gives to his chapter, the translation of his individual existence into something that will persist and be renewed. Whereas in the battle mysticism of the Astartes generally, the gene seed is understood to be the truest form of immortality available, not personal survival, but the continuation of the lineage, the passing of the Primarch's mark from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain reaching back 10,000 years. The loss of gene seed, a vial dropped in the chaos of battle, a gland destroyed by a weapon that leaves nothing recoverable, a shipment that simply disappears, is mourned in ways that go beyond grief for a fallen individual. It is a break in the chain, a generation that will not be born, a future that will not exist because the material that would have made it possible is gone. When the Tyranids first made sustained contact with the Adeptus Astartes, the chapters involved made a horrific discovery. Tyranid bioforms would consume fallen space marines completely, feasting on their biomatter and incorporating it into the hive fleet's ever-adapting biological library. Not only was the gene seed lost in those engagements, it was consumed by the very species it was most critical to fight against. This revelation profoundly affected how certain chapters approached their relationship with Tyranid enemies, and it deepened the already fierce commitment of apothecaries everywhere to gene seed recovery under any circumstances. Deep frozen catacombs connected to the apothecarian of a fortress monastery house thousands of sealed flasks, each one holding an extracted progenoid gland, a biscopea, a neuroglottis, or another space marine gene seed organ. From this store, the apothecaries will create new generations of Adeptus Astartes over years and decades, testing each sample with varying levels of radiation and chemical agents to ensure its purity, because even the smallest flaw, left undetected, can grow into terrible mutation if implanted into a neophyte. Now imagine what it means to one of these people, someone who has spent decades or centuries tending this chain with obsessive care, to discover that a vial of Primaris gene seed has been found in a ration tin by a Guardsman who does not even know what he is holding. The institutional response will be what it is: investigation, recovery, audit, accountability. But beneath the institutional response is something more personal: the knowledge that the chain has been violated, that something passed through custody or through systems adjacent to custody and escaped, that a 23-year-old from an agri-world is holding, without understanding, the biological legacy of a lineage that stretches back to the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath ancient mountains on a terra he has never seen. The weight of that knowledge, for the apothecary who eventually learns what happened, is its own kind of grief. Section 11. What happens to the Guardsman? Let us return to Advent Call and speak plainly about his possible futures. He is 23 years old. He is 2 years into a service commitment with no defined endpoint, on a world whose conflict has no visible resolution. He has found something in his rations that should not exist, and he has made the initial choice to hide it rather than report it. But whatever happens next flows directly from this choice and the choices he makes in the hours and days following. If he goes immediately to his sergeant and reports what he found: "I opened my ration tin. There was a vial inside it with Mechanicus markings. I do not know what it is. Here it is." The most immediate consequence is that the object is taken from him and his account is recorded. The chain of command passes it upward. At some point, someone with sufficient institutional awareness to understand what they are looking at reads the description and the Mechanicus cog stamp and the word Primaris, and the machinery of investigation begins. Adven's involvement in that investigation is, if his account is believed, essentially clerical. He is interviewed, his background is reviewed, his planet of origin, his 2 years of service, his assignment record, his known associations. If he has had no contact with any person or organization that raises flags, and if his account is internally consistent and matches the documentary evidence of which ration tin was distributed to his unit, he is assessed as an accidental finder with no complicity. He is released back to his unit with a notation in his file that is intentionally opaque in its phrasing, but essentially reads, "This person once handled classified biological material in circumstances that were not his fault. Keep an eye on him." He spends the rest of his service as a very slightly watched man. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. But there is a quiet notation, and occasionally someone who is not quite obviously a soldier asks questions that are not quite obviously investigative. An advent call learns over time to understand that he is being monitored in a way that is both permanent and probably benign. If he hides it, and is later found to have done so, because the investigative apparatus already moving toward his position will, in all likelihood, find him eventually, the calculus changes dramatically. The question of why he hid it, what he did with it during the time it was hidden, whether he showed it to anyone, whether he attempted to research its nature or its value, whether he made any communications with external parties during that period. All of these become live investigative questions. The commissariat does not assume innocence in the face of evidence of concealment. They assume concealment indicates knowledge. Knowledge indicates intent, and intent indicates the concealment was not innocent. At this point, Advent Call's fate depends entirely on the character and philosophical orientation of the Inquisitor handling the investigation. A Puritan sees a soldier who found classified biological material and hid it, exactly the kind of behavior preceding defection, sabotage, and heretical activity the Ordo Hereticus was created to stop. They will investigate with the assumption of guilt. They will find, because they look hard enough, things in any person's record that can be made to look suspicious if framed correctly. And they will reach a conclusion that is not good for Advent Call. A radical sees something more interesting, a lead, a thread. If Advent Call hid the vial because he was afraid, that is human and understandable and not particularly useful. But if he hid it because he was curious, if he started asking careful questions, tried to trace what Primaris meant, tried to understand where the vial might have come from, then he has already begun, independently, the kind of investigation the radical Inquisitor is conducting. He has become, accidentally and without authorization, a witness with initiative. And that is something a radical can work with. The most interesting version of Advent Call's future is the one in which the Inquisitor who reaches him is someone who cares more about the network that produced this situation than about punishing the man who found himself accidentally adjacent to it. In this version, Advent survives his encounter with inquisitorial authority by being genuinely useful, honest about what he found and when and what he did with it. The kind of person whose testimony is credible precisely because it contains the complicated, unheroic truth rather than a tidy version of events. He becomes a minor, involuntary participant in an investigation far larger than him. He is given, for the duration of that investigation, the kind of protection that comes from being needed. He is not a hero. He does not become a space marine. He does not discover within himself some latent quality that the gene seed recognizes and responds to. The gene seed cannot be used on him. He is an adult, and the implantation process requires the biological plasticity of early adolescence to work even under ideal surgical conditions. The field conditions of a forward trench are not ideal surgical conditions by any reasonable metric. He is a man who found a thing in his dinner and has to live with having found it, which, in the universe of the 41st millennium, is about as good an outcome as it gets. Section 12. The deeper horror. Information control as Imperial survival strategy. Pull back with me now, far back, to the widest possible view of what this scenario means. because there is something here that goes beyond the immediate drama of Adven Call and his vial, something that speaks to the foundations of how the Imperium works and why. The Imperium of Man is, at its deepest structural level, an information management project, not in the cynical sense of propaganda and suppression alone, though it is certainly also those things, yet in the more fundamental sense that the Imperium's ability to function as a coherent civilization, its ability to resist the constant pressure of the warp, of alien intelligence, of internal corruption, depends on controlling what ordinary people know about the universe they inhabit. The Inquisition was not founded because the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite were control freaks. It was founded because they understood, with the clarity of beings who had seen what the galaxy actually is, that the vast majority of human beings cannot maintain functional stability in the face of complete truth about the 41st millennium. The truth is this: the warp is real. It is inhabited by entities of actively hostile intelligence, sustained by the emotions of every sentient being in the galaxy. And the things living in it want to get into real space and consume everything. The things that keep them out are the Astronomicon, the Emperor's waning psychic presence, the Golden Throne, and the determined application of violence by every institution and individual serving the Imperium. If that truth were widely known in its complete form, the Imperium would not be more resilient. It would be less. Because the psychological weight of that knowledge, of knowing that you are at all times a fraction of a fraction away from the kind of reality-warping horror that the Inquisition spends its entire existence fighting, breaks people in specific and catastrophic ways. Some become paralyzed. Some become nihilistic. Some, and this is the most dangerous category, become tempted. The ruinous powers are not shy about offering what they offer: a power, meaning, the feeling of being chosen, and a person who fully understands the nature of the warp, who has not had the benefit of decades of inquisitorial training in how to carry that knowledge without being destroyed by it, is precisely the kind of person the ruinous powers target. Gene seed is not the warp. Knowing that Primaris gene seed exists and was found in a ration tin is not the kind of knowledge that breaks minds or opens warp rifts, but it is a crack in the compartmentalized reality the Imperium maintains around its ordinary citizens, and cracks have a tendency to propagate. The specific crack that Adven Call's discovery creates is this: the institutions that are supposed to be impenetrable have a gap. The chain of oversight that is supposed to control the most important biological material in the Imperium has a failure point. And if that failure point exists for gene seed, it might also exist for other things, for more dangerous things. This is why the institutional response to the discovery of a gene seed vial in a ration tin is disproportionate to the immediate physical risk of the vial itself. The vial on its own cannot harm anyone in Adven Call's trench. It cannot be used to create a space marine, or to trigger a mutation, or to open a warp rift. It is a sealed container of biological material. The physical threat it poses is essentially zero. The institutional threat it poses, the threat of the knowledge that it represents, thus the thread it provides into a network of failure or conspiracy that might extend much further, is the actual concern. And the Imperium's response to threats of this category is characteristically disproportionate, because the Imperium has learned, over 10,000 years, that small threats left unaddressed tend to become large ones. There is also the political dimension of the Primaris program specifically, which has not fully settled even in the current era. Guilliman's resurrection and the subsequent deployment of Primaris Marines has reshuffled the power dynamics within the Adeptus Astartes in ways still playing out. Firstborn chapters who received Primaris reinforcements have had to navigate questions of identity, tradition, and the relationship between old ways and new ones. Chapters founded entirely of Primaris Marines are forging cultures and traditions from essentially nothing, which is a strange and difficult position. And the question of the Primaris gene seed itself, who controls it, who can authorize its distribution, what are the protocols for its use in new foundings, is a live political question in ways that make the discovery of a misrouted vial into a potential test case, with consequences reaching far beyond the immediate investigation. If the investigation concludes that the failure was innocent and administrative, it provides ammunition to those who argue that the Primaris distribution system needs better oversight. If it concludes that the failure was deliberate, it provides ammunition to those who argue that the entire Primaris program is a security risk, that introducing a new category of the most precious military asset in the Imperium's arsenal without sufficient foundational infrastructure was irresponsible. And if it concludes that the failure was deliberate and originated within the Mechanicus itself, the political fallout reaches into the relationship between the Mechanicus and the broader Imperium in ways that nobody currently in power wants to contemplate. All of this, threading forward from a single ration tin on a world whose name Adven Call might eventually forget, held by a man who just wanted his grey porridge. Section 13. The Long Shadow. What this reveals about the setting. There is one final thing I want to say before we close, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting very good at telling stories about the enormous, about primarchs and battles that determine the fate of sectors, about institutions whose decisions cascade across centuries, about threats that consume worlds. It is designed to make you feel the scale of things, the crushing, almost incomprehensible scale of the Imperium and the universe it exists within. And within that enormous scale, stories like Adven Call's almost do not exist. There is no novel about him. There is no datasheet. There is no codex entry for the trooper who found the vial. He is invented, a thought experiment made human for the purposes of this video, and when this video ends, he will dissolve back into the anonymous masses of the Guard, into the uncountable billions who never made it into any official record. This is, in a strange way, the point. The Imperium is full of people like Adven Call, people who found themselves at the intersection of forces they could not understand, holding objects they should not have, making decisions for which nothing in their lives had prepared them. People whose involvement in significant events was entirely accidental, whose testimony would have been invaluable to the right investigator and was instead forgotten by the machinery that consumed them. People who opened their ration tin expecting grey porridge and found the unaccountable, and then had to decide what to do about it in the next few minutes, with whatever wisdom and courage and survival instinct they had accumulated in whatever life the Imperium had permitted them to live. Or the gene seed will be recovered, the investigation will proceed, the specific failure point that allowed it to enter the supply chain will be identified, or it will not. Because some things in the Imperium are too buried in layers of competing authority and failing documentation to be cleanly resolved. The political fallout will be managed in the way that political fallout in the Imperium is always managed. Partially, imperfectly, with compromises made and truths suppressed, and a final official account, cleaner and less embarrassing than the actual sequence of events. An Adven Call will either survive this, carrying the weight of what he knows into whatever remains of his service, as into the quiet moments between operations, when there is nothing to do but think about the time his ration tin contains something other than grey porridge. Or he will not survive it, in which case his experience disappears with him, added to the uncountable sum of everything the Imperium has consumed and not remembered. The 41st Millennium is built from exactly these moments, from the spaces between the great events, where ordinary people encounter extraordinary things and handle them with whatever they have. From the trench at Red Line 7, and the cold tin, and the bone-coloured vial, and the word that meant nothing to him. From the choice. That choice. And not the gene seed itself, not the investigation, not the political implications, is the real heart of the story. What do you do when you find something you were never supposed to find? What kind of person do you become in the moment after the extraordinary arrives in your ordinary life? The Imperium does not care about this question. The Imperium cares about the vial's recovery and the supply chain's integrity and the documentation trail's reconstruction. The human moment, the 23-year-old from an agri-world sitting in a trench with his heart beating faster than the artillery, is not in any ledger, but it was real. For that moment, in that trench, it was absolutely real. And in the vast darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war and the grinding machinery of survival, that kind of reality is rarer and more precious than gene seed. The apothecaries fight through fire to save what carries the future. But they punch through ruined armor to reach glands that will grow the next generation. They understand, better than almost anyone else in the galaxy, that the chain must not be broken, that what is most sacred is also most fragile, and that fragility must be defended with everything you have. Adven Call does not know any of this. He does not know what he holds. He does not know that somewhere, a chapter's apothecary is filing a discrepancy report with trembling hands, or that an inquisitor has already boarded a fast courier ship, or that the machinery of the most powerful secret police in human history has already begun to orient itself toward his position. He knows the weight of the vial, he knows the word on it, yet he knows the cold of it against his chest, and the sound of the artillery, and the smell of the trench, and the fact that Flavor 9 is getting colder every minute he sits here not eating it. That is all he knows, and he has to decide what to do next. In a universe this vast, in a war this endless, in an institution this enormous, the small decisions of small people ripple outward in ways that cannot always be predicted and are almost never acknowledged. Adven Call is not in any history. He is not anyone's hero. He is a number in a column that decided, one evening, that the column was not quite done with him yet. Whatever he decides, that is the Imperium. Enormous and uncaring and dependent at every level on the small choices of the people it barely knows exist. After closing, a quiet request at the end of a long journey. If you have made it all the way here, through the trenches and the gene seed and the mechanicus politics and the cold porridge and the young man from an agri-world who just wanted his evening meal, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Q on 40K is built for the listener who wants to sit with the lore, who wants to follow the threads all the way down, to see where the small things connect to the large ones, to feel the weight of the 41st millennium, not just as a backdrop for great battles, but as a living system that reaches into every ordinary moment and makes it complicated. If this video gave you something, a new way of thinking about the Guard, or the Primaris program, or the way the Imperium's logistics and its secrets and its people intersect, it would mean a great deal if you left a like. It is one of the quietest and most meaningful things you can do to help this kind of content reach people who would love it. And if you are not yet subscribed, please consider it. There is so much more to explore. The lore is vast and strange and full of corners that deserve exactly this kind of slow, careful attention. We will get to all of them, eventually. Together, quietly, in the dark. Thank you for listening. Q. On 40,000, for those who listen closely. Supplemental Section A. The Genovault. How gene seed is actually stored and transported. One of the details that never gets enough attention when people talk about gene seed in the 41st millennium is the sheer infrastructure required to handle it. We talk about apothecaries and progenoid glands and the 5% tithe as though these are straightforward operations. But the reality of what it takes to move living biological material across interstellar distances through warp transits in conditions that preserve its genetic integrity is extraordinary. And understanding that infrastructure helps us understand just how wrong everything went to produce the vial in Adven Call's tin. The standard container for extracted gene seed at the immediate battlefield level is what the lore calls a genoseed flask. This is not simply a sealed tube. It is an armored container designed to survive the same battlefield conditions that kill space marines: impacts, heat, chemical exposure, radiation. The flask maintains its internal environment actively, but with small chemical cells that regulate temperature and humidity regardless of external conditions, and with shielding rated to prevent even significant radiation doses from reaching the contents. The reductor on an apothecary's narthecium is calibrated to interface directly with the standard flask format, creating a sealed transfer that minimizes the exposure of the extracted gland to uncontrolled atmospheric conditions. At the chapter level, these individual flasks are gathered into larger storage structures called genovaults, essentially mobile or stationary repository units that can hold hundreds or thousands of individual flasks under consistent monitored conditions. A genovault maintained in a chapter's fortress monastery is a permanent installation deep in the most secure part of the structure. It's with redundant environmental systems, with access restrictions that go beyond what is applied to the armory or the sacred relics, because the gene seed is, in a very real sense, more important than the weapons. You can replace a weapon. You cannot replace a broken lineage. When gene seed is transported between locations, when the Mechanicus tithe is dispatched, or when a chapter sends an emergency transfer to a sister chapter that has suffered catastrophic losses, or when Call's Primaris gene seed was distributed across the galaxy during the Indomitus Crusade, it moves in specialized transport containers called methalon caskets. These are sealed with multiple redundant integrity markers, turned both mechanical and ritual. The Mechanicus layers engineering controls with prayers to the Omnissiah in a way that is simultaneously practical and theological. The caskets are suspended in active stasis fields during transit, slowing biological processes to near zero, even while the external container experiences the normal stresses of void travel. The ships that carry methalon caskets of gene seed are not ordinary transports. They are courier vessels with specific security classifications, with crews that are briefed on the nature of their cargo, with escort assignments that would be considered extreme overkill for any ordinary shipment. The movement of a chapter's gene seed tithe to Mars is treated as seriously as the movement of a Primarch's relic, because in a very functional sense it is. All of which makes the question of how a single vial ended up in a Munitorum ration supply chain even more profound, because the vial Adven Call found is not in a methalon casket. It is not in a secure genovault. It is not in an armored flask with active environmental controls. It is in a fitted molded insert in a standard issue ration tin, the kind of insert that is normally used to hold supplementary items like vitamin capsules or water purification tablets, items that are convenient but not irreplaceable, items that can tolerate the conditions of a standard supply chain without special handling. The fact that the vial was still sealed and apparently intact when Adven found it suggests two things. First, or that whoever packaged it knew what they were doing well enough to use a container that would preserve the material adequately in the short term, even without full methalon class protection. The bone-colored metal casing and the ceramic end caps are not standard ration components. They are specifically designed containment, just at a smaller and less elaborate scale than the full Geneseed flask. Someone who had access to gene seed packaging materials, but was not using the full ceremonial infrastructure of the official transfer system, managed to create something that worked well enough for a short-term transit. Second, it suggests the vial was not in the supply chain for very long before it reached Adven. Yet the standard Munitorum supply chain from production to frontline distribution can take weeks to months depending on the theatre of operations and the condition of the logistics network. Gene seed held at normal atmospheric conditions without active environmental control for that length of time would begin to degrade. Not dramatically, not catastrophically in the case of a vial designed for short-term containment, but measurably. The fact that the vial appears intact suggests either that it was inserted into the chain relatively recently, or that whoever designed the containment did so with the specific expected transit time in mind, which implies more planning than a pure accident would suggest. These are the kinds of details that matter enormously to the Inquisitor who eventually examines the vial. They are clues, not to the content of the vial, which a Mechanicus analysis can establish quickly enough, but to the intention behind its presence. A carefully designed container, inserted deliberately into a specific point in the supply chain, with a transit time calculated to preserve the contents. That is not an accident. That is a plan. And plans have authors. Supplemental Section B. The flavor of fear living inside the Munitorum's world. Let us step back into Adven Call's world for a while longer, because I want to give you the full texture of what it means to be a person inside the Munitorum's logistics ecosystem. Not as an officer, not as a commissar, not as any of the people with authority and awareness, but as the end user, and the soldier at the bottom of a supply chain so vast and so impersonal that it has never once considered the person it is ultimately designed to serve. The Departamento Munitorum is, in many ways, the most honest expression of what the Imperium actually is when you strip away the mythology. It is a bureaucracy 10,000 years old, managing logistics for an army of billions across 1,000,000 worlds. It was created during the Great Crusade from the Corps Logistici, the naval administration division that handled supply for the early legions. And in those 10,000 years of operation, it has accumulated procedures and sub-offices and regulatory frameworks at a rate that far exceeded any serious attempt at rationalization. As there are offices within the Munitorum whose function is not entirely clear even to the people working in them, who carry out procedures that were established millennia ago, following protocols whose original rationale has been lost, producing documentation that feeds into other offices that nobody is completely sure still need the documentation. This is not a flaw that can be fixed. It is the natural state of any institution that has operated for longer than the concept of reform can remain coherent. The Munitorum knows this about itself, in the way that very large, very old things sometimes seem to have a kind of institutional self-awareness that is distributed across millions of individuals who each know their small part, but not the whole. The scribes who process supply, manifests know that they are one small gear in something much larger. They do not need to understand the whole machine to turn correctly. They just turn. Day after day. Manifests in, manifests filed, manifests out. For Adven Call, this bureaucratic immensity translates into a very specific quality of daily life. The supply system is not reliable in the way that a system you trust is reliable. It is reliable in the way that weather is reliable. It follows patterns, and the patterns are mostly predictable, but there are outliers, and the outliers can be significant. Sometimes the rations arrive on schedule and are of the expected type and quality. Sometimes they are late. Sometimes they are wrong, the wrong flavor distribution or the wrong quantity. Or something is missing from the supplementary pack that should have been included. Sometimes something arrives that was not expected at all. An extra case of water Puritabs, a batch of low sticks that nobody ordered but nobody is going to refuse, a crate of emergency rations labeled for a regiment that doesn't exist anymore, and was apparently just routed to the nearest active unit by a data entry servitor following protocols that had not been updated to reflect casualties. This ambient unreliability is part of the texture of guard life. Soldiers develop a relationship with the supply system that is part resignation, part low-grade resentment, part the specific kind of grateful surprise that comes when something arrives correctly and on time. They learn to work around shortages by trading with other units, or by supplementing official rations with local acquisition when the operational situation permits, by maintaining informal networks of supply corps contacts who can sometimes, for appropriate consideration, ensure that a specific unit gets a slightly better share of whatever is available. They do not, as a rule, question what arrives. You get what you get from the Munitorum, and complaining about it generates paperwork that takes longer to process than the shortage does to resolve. If something extra shows up in a tin, the standard response is to take it. An extra protein bar, a second vitamin supplement, a folded note from some administrative processor who probably thought they were sending it to someone else entirely. These things happen. In the low-level fog of ambiguity that surrounds every interaction with the supply system, small unexpected inclusions in standard rations are not remarkable enough to report. What Adven found, of course, is remarkable enough to report several times over, but his initial framing of the experience, his initial internal categorization of it, is shaped by 2 years of a relationship with supply where unexpected thing in the expected container is not unusual. The first fraction of a second before his brain registers the specific nature of what he's looking at. His instinct is the same instinct he's developed for every other unexpected supply inclusion. Note it, probably keep it. Definitely don't make a fuss. By the time his brain has caught up with his instinct and begun processing the specific features of the object, the Mechanicus cog stamp, the sealed ceramic caps, the coolness, the precise engravings, past the word, the instinct has already done its first job. He has already closed his hand. He has already made the first choice. This is how ordinary people get caught up in extraordinary things in the Imperium. Not through dramatic confrontation with the strange and unknown, through the completely mundane mechanics of a supply system that produces enough ambient unreliability that one more unexpected thing doesn't, in the first moment, register as categorically different from all the previous unexpected things. By the time it registers, you are already holding it. You are already involved. The choice of what to do next is already on you. A supplemental section, C, the Mechanicus cog stamp. What the marking actually means. The single most significant piece of physical evidence on the vial, more significant even than the word Primaris, is the Mechanicus cog stamp. Let us spend some time with what that mark represents, and why its presence on an object found in Munitorum supply channels is, to anyone who understands it, an immediate and serious problem. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not share. This is perhaps the single most defining institutional characteristic of the organization, more fundamental even than its theological commitment to the machine god or its doctrinal suspicion of innovation. The Mechanicus guards its technologies, its materials, its research, its data, and its personnel with an intensity that goes far beyond any other imperial institution. Partly this is practical. In the Mechanicus's view, the things it controls are the most valuable things in the Imperium, and their loss, or unauthorized use, has historically produced outcomes ranging from bad to catastrophic. Partly it is theological. The sacred technical knowledge of the Mechanicus is the closest thing to divine revelation that their culture possesses, and allowing it to flow outside controlled channels would be, in their theological framework, a form of profanation. The cog stamp on a piece of Mechanicus-originated material is not just a manufacturer's mark. It is a statement of ownership, of ongoing responsibility, and of the Mechanicus's claim to jurisdiction over whatever happens to that material. When you see a cog stamp on something, it means the Mechanicus made it, the Mechanicus tracked it. And the Mechanicus expects to maintain oversight of it for the entirety of its operational life. It means that if you are holding it without authorization, you are not just in possession of stolen property in the ordinary sense. You are in the position of someone who has taken something from an institution that does not recognize any authority above its own interpretation of the Omnissiah's will, and that has the resources and the inclination to pursue recovery with extreme thoroughness. The specific format of the cog stamp on the vial would tell an expert examiner quite a lot. The Mechanicus does not use a single universal cog stamp. The mark varies in its specific form depending on the forge world of origin, the sub-department of the Mechanicus that produced or certified the item, and the classification level of the material. A casual observer sees a cog. An inquisitor sees provenance, chain of custody, and the specific organizational subunit within the Mechanicus that should have this material under its control, which is the starting point for the investigation into how it ended up somewhere else. In the case of Primaris gene seed specifically, the tracking architecture around the cog stamp is more elaborate than for most Mechanicus materials. Call's program produced its own documentation frameworks, partly because the material was new and there were no existing frameworks to slot it into, and partly because Call himself is the kind of individual who generates documentation as a natural byproduct of doing anything, to such an extent that the Mechanicus's own records officers have had difficulty keeping up with the volume. And the serial designation beneath the cog stamp on the vial would identify not just the general category of the material, but the specific cultivation batch, the facility where it was grown, the date of cultivation, the projected transfer destination, and the identity of the apothecary or Mechanicus biologist who certified its purity before packaging. All of this information, to an investigator who knows how to read it, is a thread. A very long, very specific thread that leads, if followed correctly, to the exact point in the supply chain where this vial diverged from its authorized path. And the divergence point is where the investigation actually begins, because whoever or whatever is at that divergence point is the real subject of the inquiry, not the vial and not Adven Call. The irony is that the cog stamp, which was placed on the vial specifically to maintain oversight and control, is also the thing most likely to enable its recovery and the identification of the security failure. The Mechanicus's obsession with documentation and marking is, in this case, working exactly as intended, just delayed by the accident or conspiracy that put the vial into the wrong channel in the first place. The mark will lead the investigators back to the source. The question is only whether what they find there is a lonely mistake or the tip of something much larger. Supplemental Section D. The silence that follows. What the wider regiment experiences. Let us zoom out slightly from Adven Call specifically and think about what happens to the people around him when the investigation begins. Well, because the investigation does not stay narrowly focused on one trooper in one trench. It cannot. The nature of what is being investigated, a security breach involving classified biological material of the highest sensitivity, requires a broader perimeter of examination, and everyone inside that perimeter is affected. The squad that Adven Call belongs to is the first ring of involvement. These are the people who shared his immediate operational environment, who ate from the same distribution of rations, who would have noticed if he had been behaving unusually in the period after he found the vial. When the Inquisitor's people begin their quiet preliminary work, before the Inquisitor themselves arrives, but in the phase of information gathering that always precedes a direct interview, the squad members will be separately and casually questioned in the way that skilled investigators make their questions seem entirely casual. Did Trooper Call seem unusual after evening rations on that specific day? Was there anything in his behavior, his demeanor, his conversation that struck anyone as noteworthy? Did he speak to anyone outside the squad that evening? Most of them will say no to all of these questions because the answer is probably no. Adven Call, as we have established, has 2 years of experience in not being remarkable. He knows how to be present without being noticed. And even if he was fractionally more quiet than usual that evening, even if Sergeant Thomas paused in his writing to look at him for a moment, with the mild attentiveness of someone whose job requires noticing things, even then, the deviation from his normal baseline would be small enough that the investigator, unless they are genuinely extraordinary at their job, would not extract it from the background noise of the squad's collective memory. The Supply Corps staff who handled the distribution of that day's rations are the second ring of involvement. These are the soldiers and, in many cases, the Munitorum adepts who loaded and sorted the crates, who assigned the individual tins to individual squads, who signed off on the manifests that said a certain number of units of a certain type went to a certain location at a certain time. These people will be examined with considerably more intensity than the combat squad, because if the vial was inserted deliberately into a specific tin rather than randomly into the supply chain, someone in the distribution process may have made a specific decision about where that tin went, even if they did so unconsciously, following instructions that seemed innocuous at the time, filing a manifest that seemed routine. Their actions are part of the path the vial traveled. The transit hubs and supply depots that handled the shipment before it reached the forward position form the outer rings of the investigation, each one further from Adven Call's trench, and each one adding to the complexity of the documentary trail. At each point, as the investigators are looking for the moment when the vial's path diverged from the standard flow of materials, the moment when something in the system handled it differently from everything else in the same crate, that moment is where the story begins. For the people in all of these rings who have done nothing wrong, who handled materials normally, filed manifests correctly, distributed rations in the standard way, the investigation is a source of anxiety disproportionate to their actual involvement. Being questioned by inquisitorial staff, even as a witness rather than a suspect, is an experience that occupies a specific and unpleasant place in the social imagination of imperial citizens. The Inquisition's reputation is not just for finding the guilty, it is for finding things in everyone, and for asking questions that lead to other questions, for the way that even a correctly answered question sometimes becomes the first step towards something you did not intend to step toward. The Supply Corps adept who loaded the crate that contained Advent's tin will spend weeks afterward replaying every routine decision they made that day, wondering which one looked suspicious from the outside. The depot worker who processed the shipment 3 hubs back will have nightmares about a manifest entry they cannot even remember making. None of these people did anything wrong. All of them will carry the experience of having been briefly inside an inquisitorial investigation, which is an experience that leaves marks that are not visible but are not gone. This is part of what gene seed's sanctity actually costs when it is violated. Not just the immediate crisis of a missing vial, the ripple effect through the lives of the ordinary people who, through no fault of their own, become part of the story of how it got lost. Supplemental Section E. The Theology of Gene Seed. Sacred material in a sacred war. There is a dimension to gene seed that we have touched on but not fully explored, and it is the one that perhaps matters most in the emotional and thematic sense. The theology of the thing. The way that the Astartes' relationship with their own biology has become, over 10,000 years, inseparable from their religious and spiritual life. The Adeptus Astartes, taken as a whole, exist in a curious theological position within the broader Imperium of man. They are the creation of the Emperor, indirectly and specifically, not in the diffuse sense in which all humanity is the Emperor's creation, but in the literal sense that the Emperor of mankind personally designed and built the biological program that makes them what they are. They serve the Emperor. They die for the Emperor. And the gene seed within them is the physical expression of their connection to that divine adjacent figure, carried in their bodies as a kind of living proof of the relationship. Different chapters have developed very different theological frameworks for understanding this. Some are relatively straightforward in their worship of the Emperor as a god. They pray, they maintain the rituals of the imperial creed, they frame their role as crusaders fighting in a holy war on behalf of a living deity whose power manifests through their transhuman bodies. As for these chapters, the gene seed is sacred in roughly the same sense that any divinely given gift is sacred. It comes from above, it is not fully comprehensible, and it should be treated with reverence commensurate with its origin. Others have developed more nuanced frameworks. The blood angels, burdened by the red thirst and the black rage that haunt their gene seed lineage, have built an entire theological and psychological apparatus around the question of what the flaw in their inheritance means. Is it a curse? A test? The shadow of Sanguinius's death, eternally present in the genetic material he bequeathed. Their relationship with their gene seed is more complicated and more intimate than most. Because the gene seed does not just make them superhuman, it carries within it a specific form of suffering that must be managed at both the individual and the institutional level. The Space Wolves, famously resistant to the standard framework of the Imperial Creed, have developed their own mythology around the Canis Helix and the primal power it embodies. Their gene seed is not just the mark of a Primarch. It is, in their theological understanding, something closer to a wild, half-tamed force of nature that makes them what they are, in a way that transcends simple biological mechanism. The Wolfen, those space wolves who succumb fully to the transformative pressure of the Canis Helix, are understood not just as casualties, but as something more complicated. Proof that the line between the transhuman and the primal is thinner than anyone would like to think. The Dark Angels carry a relationship with their gene seed that is intertwined with the great secret that has defined their chapter's history for 10,000 years. A secret so old and so heavy that it has shaped everything from their organizational structure to their most intimate theological assumptions. Their gene seed is the inheritance of the lion, and the lion's legacy is complicated by what happened at Caliban, and what happened at Caliban shapes how Dark Angels understand everything, including the biology they carry in their bodies. For the Primaris Marines, the theological dimension of their gene seed is newer and less settled, but they bear the inheritance of their Primarchs just as Firstborn do. The sinew coils and the Magnificat do not replace the lineage, they enhance it. But they also carry something that Firstborn do not. The Mark of Call's 10,000-year project, the material of the Sanguinius Portum, which was derived from the Primarchs directly in a way that standard gene seed, passed through generations of cultivation, is not. There is a theological question embedded in this that the chapters of the Ultima Founding are still working out. What does it mean to carry gene seed this pure? What is the spiritual significance of being closer to the Primarch template than any Marine has been in 10,000 years? Is this a blessing, a responsibility, a weight? These are not idle questions, lest they shape how Primaris Marines understand themselves and their mission in ways that will affect chapter culture for centuries to come. And they add a dimension to the question of a misrouted vial that goes beyond logistics and politics. Somewhere in the gene seed theology of the chapter, whose material ended up in a ration tin, there is a wound, a tear in the sacred chain, a moment when the most holy material in their keeping left the context that made it holy and entered the profane world of grey porridge and munitorum logistics. The apothecary, who eventually learns what happened, will have to find a framework for understanding that wound. For understanding that the chain was broken, however briefly, however accidentally, however the investigation ultimately resolves the question of how it happened. It's because for all the institutional significance of the breach, there is a personal and spiritual dimension to it as well. Gene seed is not just a biological resource, it is a sacred trust. And a sacred trust that has been compromised is something that requires, beyond investigation and accountability, a form of processing that is harder to name and harder to complete. Supplemental section F. What we learn from asking this question. There is a reason this scenario, a guardsman finding Primaris gene seed in his rations, resonates as deeply as it does when you allow yourself to really think through its implications. It is not just an interesting logistical puzzle, though it is certainly that. It is a scenario that, in following it out, forces you to engage with some of the most fundamental things about the 41st millennium as a setting. And it asks you to think about the gap between the extraordinary and the ordinary, and about what happens when they intersect without warning. The Imperium is full of extraordinary things. Primarchs, gene seed, warp travel, the Golden Throne, the entities that live in the immaterium and reach into the real. And the Imperium is also full of ordinary things. Ration tins, supply manifests, trench maintenance schedules, the particular flavor profile of nutrient gruel flavor 9. These two categories are supposed to be separate. The extraordinary is managed by institutions designed specifically to manage the extraordinary. The ordinary is left to the vast, impersonal machinery of mundane survival. When they intersect, when an object from the extraordinary ends up in the hands of someone from the ordinary, what results is not just a narrative moment. It is a diagnostic test of the system, a probe that, inserted into the machinery and following its path, reveals something about where the machinery's gaps and failure points actually are. Every scenario like this is, in its own small way, a stress test of the Imperium's foundational architecture. And the Imperium, as we have seen in running this particular stress test, has gaps, has failure points, has areas where the official documentation does not reflect reality, where the institutional claims of control are broader than the actual enforcement of that control, where the extraordinary and the ordinary can intersect in ways that should not be possible and yet clearly are. This is ultimately why the Warhammer 40,000 setting is so compelling to explore in exactly this way. It is a setting designed to be examined at every scale simultaneously, from the galaxy-spanning politics of the High Lords of Terror, down through the maneuvering of Inquisitors and Chapter Masters, down through the supply chains of the Munitorum, all the way down to the trench at Red Line 7 and the man with the ration tin. Every layer is connected to every other layer. Every small thing has implications that reach upward into the large things, and every large thing, followed far enough downward, touches the lives of small people who are just trying to get through the evening with a tin of grey porridge. The guardsman who found the gene seed is not important because of what he found. He is important because of what his finding it reveals. Also about the supply chain, about the oversight architecture, about the gaps between what the Imperium claims to control and what it actually controls, about the way that even in a civilization of this scale and sophistication, small things slip through, and when they do, they carry with them threads that, if pulled, unravel something significant. Adven Call will probably never understand the full significance of the evening he opened his tin. He will know that something happened, that it was serious, that the machinery of imperial authority took an interest in him for a period. He may or may not survive that interest. He will not, regardless, be told the full context of what he found, or what it meant, or what the investigation ultimately determined. He will just know that one evening, Flavor 9 turned out not to be Flavor 9. And that, for the rest of his life, whenever he opens a ration tin, he will feel it. That fractional hesitation, that involuntary moment of wondering, just for a second, just long enough to remember. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is what ordinary people are left with. Not the knowledge, not the significance, just the wondering. End of script Q. On 40,000, for those who listen closely. Supplemental section G. The ripple effect. What this means for the chapter whose gene seed was lost. We have spent a great deal of time thinking about what this event means for Adven Call, for the Inquisition, for the Munitorum's supply chain integrity, and for the broader political landscape of the Primaris program. But there is one more perspective that deserves careful consideration, and it is in some ways the most immediate and the most personal of all of them. What does this mean for the chapter whose gene seed is missing? Because somewhere, a Space Marine chapter is short one vial. This might seem like a small thing in the context of everything else we have discussed. A chapter maintains thousands of sealed flasks in its apothecarium. The loss of a single vial is not, in mathematical terms, a catastrophic event. Chapters have survived much larger losses. Entire battles have ended with gene seed unrecovered from fallen brothers, and the chapter absorbed those losses and continued. The Munitorum tithe accounting that eventually flags the discrepancy does so in the context of a much larger shipment, and the individual vial represents a fraction of the total. But that is not how chapters think about gene seed. That is not the framework within which an apothecary operates. For an apothecary, every progenoid gland is a fallen brother. Every vial of cultivated material is a future neophyte. Every loss is individual, and every individual loss matters in a way that the mathematics of scale actively obscures. Consider what the contents of that vial represent in concrete terms. Primaris gene seed is typically cultivated in batches. The germ cells from a single progenoid gland can be cultured into multiple sets of the individual organ implants required for one neophyte. A single vial of the type that Adven found, small, compact, evidently designed for efficient transport rather than maximum volume, might contain the cultivated material for one complete set of Primaris implants, the sinew coils, in the Magnificat and the Belisarian furnace, along with the foundational gene seed organs that the Primaris enhancements build upon. One complete set of implants represents one future Space Marine. Not an abstract future Space Marine, not a statistical placeholder in a recruitment projection, but a specific young man who will now never be recruited into this chapter, who will live out whatever life his world offers him, probably short, probably brutal, possibly ending in anonymity on a battlefield that will not remember him, because the biological material that would have transformed him into something extraordinary has ended up in a Munitorum supply chain and is currently sitting in the breast pocket of a guardsman who does not know what it is. The apothecary, who eventually accounts for the missing vial, will file the appropriate documentation. They will record the loss in the chapter's gene seed register with the same care that they record every other loss. They will note the circumstances as they understand them. Supply chain failure, investigation ongoing, material unrecovered at time of filing, and they will assign the loss the appropriate designation in the chapter's internal records. And then they will move on, because there is always more work to be done, always more material to catalogue and test and protect, always more brothers to minister to. But in the quiet of the apothecarian, in the moments between tasks when there is nothing to occupy the hands and the mind is free to wander, the apothecary will think about that vial, about where it is, and about whether it is still intact, about whether the ceramic caps are still sealed, whether the controlled atmosphere inside is still stable, whether the material is still viable, or whether it has begun to degrade in some supply depot somewhere on a world they will never visit. They will think about the young man who will not be recruited. Probably they cannot picture him. He is a hypothetical, a future that was foreclosed before it began. But they know that he exists somewhere, or will exist, or would have existed, and that the material that would have called him to extraordinary service is currently elsewhere, and that this is wrong in a way that the word wrong cannot fully contain. The chapter's chief apothecary will have to decide whether to report the loss to the chapter master. Well, this is not a difficult decision. The protocols require it, but the conversation itself will be difficult. Chapter masters do not take news about gene seed losses with equanimity, even when the losses are small and the circumstances are outside anyone's control. The chapter master's response will be shaped by their personality, by the chapter's culture, by the current operational status of the chapter, and how much mental bandwidth they have available for this specific kind of frustration. Some will be measured and pragmatic, focusing on the investigation and the systemic improvements that need to follow. Others will be angrier, seeing in the loss not just the material, but the institutional failure, the gap in the oversight system that allowed something this sacred to slip into the wrong hands. All of them, regardless of their public response, will carry a private weight that is specifically the weight of responsibility for something irreplaceable that is temporarily or permanently out of reach. This is the condition of every apothecary and every chapter master in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. The knowledge that you are the steward of something that cannot be replaced, and that stewardship has limits, and that the universe will test those limits without mercy. The investigation will eventually produce answers, or as close to answers as the Imperium's investigative apparatus can achieve. The vial will be recovered, or it will not. If it is recovered intact, it will be returned to the chapter with all appropriate ceremony and documentation. And the apothecary will file the closure of the loss report and place the vial back in the vault and feel, if not relief exactly, then the particular quality of restored order that comes from having something that was wrong made as right as it can be made. If it is not recovered, if the investigation determines that the vial has been further misrouted or has been destroyed, or has been taken by parties whose intentions the investigation cannot fully establish, the loss will be permanent. The documentation will be closed as unresolved. The record will show a vial that entered an unauthorized channel and was never recovered. And the apothecary will adjust the cultivation projections for the next decade, reducing them by one, and file the paperwork and move on. One vial, one future space marine who will never be, one small permanent, an unremarkable reduction in the capacity of a chapter to project the Emperor's will into a galaxy that needs every warrior it can find. In the grim darkness of the far future, this is what loss looks like at its most granular, not the dramatic, galaxy-shaking losses of legend. The small, specific, irreversible loss of one future that was foreclosed before it had a chance to begin, recorded in a ledger that nobody outside the chapter will ever read, carried in the quiet of an apothecary who has too much else to do to grieve for very long. This is the texture of the 41st millennium at its most honest, not the grand tragedy, but the thousand small ones. Not the epoch-defining catastrophe, but the daily accumulation of small wrongnesses that the system is too large and too broken to prevent. The vial in the ration tin. It's the future Marine who will not be. The apothecary filing the paperwork. The guardsman in his trench carrying something sacred without knowing it, deciding in real time what kind of person the Imperium has made him. The galaxy burns. The war grinds on. And in the apothecarian, the ledger is updated by one, and the work continues. Because it always continues. Because stopping is not an option. Because the Emperor requires it. And that has always been enough. Full script word count. Approximately 21,500 words, Q on 40,000, for those who listen closely. A final note on the nature of the Imperium. I want to close with one last thought, because I think it matters, and I think it is easy to miss. The story we have told today, of a ration tin and a vial, and a young man from an agri-world who did not ask for any of this, is, at its heart, and a story about distance. The distance between the people who make decisions and the people who live with the consequences of those decisions. The distance between the institutions that claim control over things and the actual state of those things in the real world. At the sharp end, where the ration tins are opened and the artillery runs, and the squad arguments have been going on for 4 days and nobody knows when the operation is going to start. The Munitorum administers supply chains that stretch across light years and manage the needs of billions of soldiers. It does this with remarkable efficacy, on average, given the scale of the task and the resources available. But remarkable efficacy on average means that at the individual level, at the level of Advent Call in his trench opening his tin, the system has outliers, has moments where the efficiency collapses into something strange and specific and unmanageable by any standard protocol, has moments where the gap between what the system claims to be and what it actually is becomes visible in ways that are jarring and sometimes dangerous. The Mechanicus claims control over its gene seed with the absolute confidence of an institution that has never seriously imagined the control failing. The documentation is meticulous. The protocols are elaborate. The theological and ceremonial weight of the oversight system is real and substantial. And still, a vial ends up in a ration tin. And still, a guardsman holds it and does not know what it is. And still, the gap between the claim and the reality is wide enough for something sacred to fall through. This is not a bug in the Imperium. It is the Imperium. As it is what happens when any system grows large enough, old enough, complex enough, that its internal reality and its official self-representation begin to diverge in ways that are too subtle to be noticed until they produce something specific and undeniable. The Imperium of Man is the largest, oldest, most complex system in the known galaxy. Of course, it has moments where its internal reality diverges from its official self-representation. Of course, sacred things slip through gaps. Of course, ordinary people end up holding extraordinary objects without knowing what they are. Of course, the machinery of investigation and accountability activated by the discovery sometimes causes more disruption than the breach itself. This is just what 10,000 years looks like. But this is what it looks like to be the last defense of humanity in a hostile galaxy, to have held that position for millennia, to have built the structures necessary to continue holding it at a cost that, distributed across 10,000 years and 1 trillion lives, is enormous in aggregate and invisible in any individual instance. The vial will be recovered, or it will not. The investigation will reach conclusions, or it will not. Advent Call will survive, or he will not. And the galaxy will continue, as it always continues, with the war and the rations, and the grey porridge, and the 16 flavours, and the quiet, extraordinary moments when the distance between the sacred and the mundane collapses without warning. Oh, for those of us who love this setting, who find in its darkness and its complexity and its tragedy something true about the nature of vast systems and the people who live inside them, these moments are why. Not the battles and the Primarchs and the galaxy-shaking events. The trench, the tin, the word that meant nothing to a young man who just wanted his grey porridge. That is the 41st Millennium, and I love it. Thank you once more for listening.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.